She didn't flinch when the tray hit the floor. She didn't raise her voice when Director Kyle Bennett jabbed his finger at her face in front of 60 hospital employees who suddenly found their shoes very interesting. 29-year-old Emily Carter stood in the middle of the Riverside Medical Center cafeteria in her standard issue blue scrubs, shoulders back, jaw tight, and absorbed every word the director threw at her like she'd been trained to take incoming fire. Because she had been. Nobody in that room knew that. Nobody thought to ask. They saw a young staff nurse who had committed the apparent crime of sitting at the wrong table during a closed administrative breakfast, and they watched their director make an example of her with the enthusiasm of a man who had never once been told no. Emily lowered her eyes. Not because she was ashamed, because she had learned a long time ago that the people most dangerous to underestimate are the ones who never feel the need to prove anything. Beneath her left sleeve, pressed flat against her forearm, was a tattoo she hadn't looked at in months. A small thing. A unit designation and a date. The kind of mark that means nothing to civilians and everything to the people who recognize it. Within the hour, every person in that cafeteria would wish they had asked. Before we go any further, if you're watching this right now, drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Like this video, subscribe if you haven't already, and stay with me all the way to the end. You will not want to miss what happens next. The trouble had started, as it often does at Riverside Medical Center, with a meeting that wasn't supposed to matter. The hospital occupied a full city block in the middle of Harlow Falls, a mid-sized city in the upper Midwest that had rebuilt itself twice, once after a factory collapse in the 80s, and once after a flood that took out half the downtown in 2009. The medical center was the city's largest employer and operated with the particular institutional pride of a place that knew it. 6 floors, 2 satellite clinics, a recently renovated trauma wing funded by a combination of federal grants and private donations, and an administrative layer so thick it had developed its own internal politics, its own loyalty hierarchies, its own version of justice. Kyle Bennett had been director of clinical operations for 4 years. He was 51, had never practiced medicine himself, and had climbed through healthcare administration with a combination of political instincts and a talent for making himself indispensable to people who didn't look closely at how he operated. He was broad across the shoulders, wore his salt and pepper hair in a careful side part, and had the handshake of a man who wanted you to know exactly where you stood relative to him. Staff respected him the way people respect a weather system, not because they admired it, but because it affected them regardless. Emily Carter had been at Riverside for 7 months. She'd transferred in from a smaller facility in a town 3 hours east, her paperwork clean, her references adequate, her personal history vague in the way that either suggested trauma or privacy, and most of the HR department hadn't pushed to find out which. She worked night rotation in the surgical recovery unit, did her job without complaint, and kept almost entirely to herself. She ate alone when she ate at the hospital at all, which wasn't often. The nurses who'd tried to include her early on had gotten polite deflection and eventually stopped trying. The ones who hadn't tried simply formed their opinions from a distance, quiet, capable, a little cold, probably carrying something. They weren't wrong about the last part. The cafeteria incident had begun with a scheduling error, or what Bennett would later call a scheduling error when he needed it to sound minor. The closed administrative breakfast was a monthly gathering of department heads, senior coordinators, and a rotating selection of physicians Bennett used to consolidate his reading of the hospital's political temperature. The event was held in the east section of the cafeteria, which was cordoned off with retractable barriers and a sign that had, on this particular Thursday morning, fallen flat on the floor sometime before 7 a.m. Emily had come off a 12-hour overnight shift, picked up a tray, walked past where the barrier should have been, and sat down at an empty corner table with coffee and toast because she was exhausted and her feet hurt and she wasn't looking for anything except 10 minutes of quiet. Bennett had noticed her when he stood to refill his water glass. He'd crossed the room before anyone could register what was happening. "Excuse me." His voice carried the particular flatness of someone who has decided on the outcome before the conversation begins. "This is a closed event." Emily looked up. She recognized him from the staff directory photo. She'd done her homework when she arrived at any new workplace, identified authority structures, assessed leadership temperament, made notes she never shared with anyone. "Sorry," she said, The sign was down. I didn't realize. The sign being down doesn't make this a public area. He glanced at her badge. Carter, surgical recovery? Yes? You're not authorized to be in this section. She picked up her tray. She was already moving. That should have been the end of it, but Bennett had an audience and a long week, and whatever was grinding behind his eyes that morning made him step sideways to block her path. I want to make sure we're clear, he said, loudly enough that the 30 people at the surrounding tables stopped their conversations. This hospital operates on a clear chain of authority. Staff nurses, particularly staff nurses on overnight rotation who apparently don't know how to read posted notices, are not part of administrative functions. Is that understood? Emily looked at him, not challenging, not submissive, assessing. Yes. You people think because you show up and do the baseline job, you're entitled to access that you haven't earned. You're not. He turned slightly, addressing the room as much as her. What I'm not going to tolerate is staff wandering into spaces where they don't belong because they've decided the rules don't apply to them. That kind of attitude is exactly what drags down an operation like this. Several people were staring at their plates. A few were watching. One senior administrator, a woman in her 40s named Priscilla Odom, who ran patient services and had the expression of someone watching a car slowly roll toward a wall, opened her mouth and then closed it. Emily said nothing. She adjusted her grip on the tray, inclined her head slightly, and walked out. She didn't slam anything. She didn't look back. She took her coffee and her toast to a stairwell on the 3rd floor where she ate alone standing up, looking out a window at the parking structure across the street, and she thought about a FOB in eastern Kandahar province, where a medic she'd trained had stitched his own arm in the dark because they were past the point of calling anything in. She thought about the particular stillness that comes when you have learned to be the calmest person in any given room because the alternative is unacceptable. She thought about why she was here at this hospital in this city, what she was working through, and whether any of it was going according to anything like a plan. It wasn't, particularly. But she was still standing. That was something. She went home at 8:15, slept until 2 in the afternoon, and came back for her next shift at 7 p.m. What Emily didn't know was that Bennett wasn't finished. He'd pulled her personnel file by 9 a.m. He'd placed a call to the nursing supervisor, a man named Greg Tullis, who had been hoping for a promotion for 3 years and had learned to navigate that hope by agreeing with Bennett on most things. He'd flagged Emily's file with a personnel review notation, vague enough to be defensible, specific enough to function as a warning shot, and he'd mentioned to 2 department heads over lunch that the overnight staff was getting sloppy and he was considering some restructuring. The message moved through the hospital the way these things always do, sideways, in pieces, arriving distorted at its destination. By the time Emily came in for her Thursday night shift, Greg Tullis was waiting for her at the nursing station with the expression of a man delivering news he'd been given rather than news he believed. There's going to be a performance review, he said, not quite meeting her eyes. Standard protocol after a conduct notation. Emily stopped pulling on her gloves. What conduct notation? From this morning, administrative area incident. She looked at him for a moment. The sign was on the floor. I understand that, but has anyone checked whether that's accurate, the sign being down? Greg's jaw shifted. Emily, I want to be honest with you. Director Bennett he's flagged this personally, which means it's going to go to a formal review regardless of the specifics. And during the review period, you'll be reassigned from the surgical recovery unit. Reassigned to what? Supply inventory coordination. Building C. She looked at him for another moment. Building C was a satellite annex used for storage and overflow. It had 4 rooms and saw maybe 15 patients a month, mostly minor outpatient procedures. It was, in the hierarchy of Riverside Medical Center, the professional equivalent of being asked to wait in the car. Okay, Emily said. Emily, I heard you, Greg. She pulled the second glove on. When does the reassignment start? Monday? Then I'll finish this shift and the weekend shifts, and I'll report to Building C on Monday. He looked like he wanted to say something else. Something maybe closer to the truth. That he thought this was wrong, that he'd been uncomfortable all day, that he'd told himself it was just procedure while knowing it wasn't. But he didn't say any of it. He nodded and walked away, and Emily turned to the patient board and started her shift. She worked through to 4 a.m. with the same focus she brought to everything. A post-op patient in room 6 developed unexpected tachycardia. She caught it before the monitor alarm fully triggered, flagged the attending, and stood by while he adjusted the medication protocol. A family in the waiting area was going on hour 9 of sitting with a father who'd come through a triple bypass. She found them fresh coffee from the break room supply and sat with them for 3 minutes, long enough to tell them in plain language that the numbers were good and what to watch for on the recovery timeline. Not soft reassurance, actual information. The mother held her hand. Emily walked back to the station afterward and updated the charts, and didn't think about Monday. Friday passed. Saturday passed. Sunday evening, she packed a small bag, her own small trauma kit that she carried everywhere out of habit, her backup phone, a change of scrubs, and drove to Riverside through the kind of October rain that made everything gray and close. She had been at the nursing station in Building C for 45 minutes on Monday morning when the radio crackled. It was the hospital's general emergency frequency, which ran on a small speaker near the door that mostly emitted static and the occasional paging announcement. Emily had the speaker there because Building C had iffy cell reception, and she'd gotten into the habit on her first day of keeping it on low in the background. She'd been doing inventory of the crash cart supplies, checking expiration dates, making notes, finding that 2 items were missing from the checklist, when the tone changed. Not an announcement, a live call, possible cardiac event, lobby level, multiple personnel responding, requesting any available trauma-certified staff. Emily was out the door before the sentence finished. Building C was a 3-minute walk from the main building across a covered connector bridge that smelled like industrial cleaner and wet concrete. She moved through it at a pace that wasn't quite running, efficient, deliberate, covering ground. She was pulling the secondary stairwell door open when she heard the second radio update through someone else's pager. Patient is Senator Marcus Aldrin. Repeat, Senator Marcus Aldrin, condition critical, lobby level. The lobby of Riverside Medical Center's main building was designed to communicate stability, high ceilings, natural light from a glass atrium, seating arranged in careful clusters, art on the walls selected by a committee for its calming neutrality. What it looked like at 9:17 a.m. on a Monday was a controlled collapse. Staff were converging from 3 directions. A cluster of people in suits stood at the outer edge of what had become an informal perimeter around a man on the floor. The man was in his early 60s, wearing a dark jacket over an open collar, and he was not fully conscious. 2 physicians were arguing. Emily heard them before she saw them, one voice rising over the other, the familiar sound of expertise in conflict under pressure, which is one of the worst sounds in medicine because it costs time. Definitely arrhythmia. We need to get him upstairs. Moving him in this condition is a risk. He needs to be stabilized here first. We don't have the equipment. She moved through the outer ring of observers, badge forward, and crouched next to the senator without asking for permission. Up close, she registered several things in about 4 seconds. The quality of his skin color, the way he was breathing, shallow, fast, with a slight wheeze on the exhale that had nothing to do with the heart. The position of his hands, the fact that his lips had a bluish tinge that was subtly wrong for a cardiac presentation. And the smell. A very specific smell, faint but present, sweet and chemical underneath the lobby's recycled air. She stood back up and said, "This isn't cardiac." The arguing physicians turned. One of them, Dr. Harlan Voss, the head of cardiology, who Emily knew by reputation, if not by face, looked at her with the expression of a man who had been interrupted in the middle of something important by someone he did not recognize. "Who are you?" he said. "Carter, surgical recovery. I'm telling you his presentation isn't matching a cardiac event. The wheezing is expiratory, not inspiratory. He's got... His EKG shows arrhythmia." "I know. I'm saying the arrhythmia might be secondary." She pointed at the senator's hands without touching him. "Look at the nail beds. That's not standard cyanosis. That's a different perfusion pattern. And there's an odor. Very faint, acetone adjacent. Not quite. Something metabolic." Voss stared at her. "You're a recovery nurse." "Yes. This is a cardiac situation." Then treat the arrhythmia, but you need to also run a tox panel and check for organophosphate exposure right now. Behind her, someone said her name. She turned. 3 people had just pushed through the lobby's main entrance. 2 men and a woman, all in what was technically civilian clothing but worn with the particular precision that took training to unlearn. The woman was in her early 50s, short gray-streaked hair, and she was looking at Emily with an expression that had stopped itself just short of something harder to manage. The woman said, "Carter." Emily straightened slowly. A feeling moved through her chest that she didn't have a name for. Something between relief and the particular ache of a door you thought was closed swinging open. "Colonel Jarvis," she said. Colonel Dana Jarvis, United States Army Medical Command, retired 14 months, had spent 22 years assessing situations and the people in them, and she did not generally display reaction on her face. She was displaying something now. She crossed the lobby in 8 steps and stopped in front of Emily with her arms at her sides and a muscle working in her jaw. "I almost didn't—" "You look different," Jarvis said. "How long have you been here?" 7 months. "Here, in this hospital." "Yes, ma'am." Jarvis turned to look at the senator on the floor, then back at Emily. "You've assessed him?" "Preliminary only. I think it's an organophosphate exposure, possibly inadvertent, something environmental in the last 12 hours. The arrhythmia is real, but I don't think it's primary. The respiratory pattern is wrong and there's a metabolic odor." Jarvis looked at the 2 men she'd come in with. One of them was already pulling equipment from a bag. "Run the panel," she said. "Full tox, prioritize cholinergic compounds." Then to Voss, "I'm Colonel Dana Jarvis, Medical Command. I'd appreciate your cooperation." Voss looked at her, looked at Emily, and said, with the slightly dazed quality of a man revising several things at once, "What is going on?" "A nurse is trying to save your patient's life," Jarvis said. "I'd suggest letting her." Pity. Emily didn't take over. She didn't grandstand. She moved to the senator's side, asked one of the attending nurses to hold a light at the right angle, and conducted a rapid secondary assessment while relaying findings in a calm, sequential monotone, the kind of voice that doesn't perform urgency because it doesn't need to. Her hands were steady. They were always steady. It was one of the first things Jarvis had noted about her during selection 8 years ago, at a base in North Carolina where Emily had been 21 and so new to everything that the competence had seemed almost implausible. The hands didn't shake. Under pressure, they moved more precisely, as if anxiety had somewhere else to go. The tox panel came back in 13 minutes. Organophosphate positive. Emily had already prepared for it. She talked Voss through the treatment protocol, used the word atropine before he did, and when the attending physician finally found his footing and took the lead on administration, she stepped back without requiring anyone to acknowledge her. The senator's monitor steadied at 9:51 a.m. His blood pressure came up in controlled increments. His breathing eased. By 10:15, he was conscious and asking for water. The lobby had gone very quiet. Not the quiet of an emergency winding down. The specific silence of a room in which many people are processing the same information and have not yet decided what to do with it. Kyle Bennett had arrived sometime in the middle of it. He'd come down from the 4th floor in response to the emergency, absorbed the situation in pieces, and was now standing at the edge of the atrium with the expression of a man who has walked into a conversation that has been going on for much longer than he realized. He'd seen Emily. He'd seen the military personnel. He'd seen Voss defer to her, subtly and then not subtly, as the situation unspooled. He had not yet moved or spoken. He was still processing. Jarvis found Emily near the nursing station on the far side of the lobby, writing up her incident notes in a small notebook she'd pulled from her jacket pocket. "You're writing your own record," Jarvis said. It wasn't a question. "Habit. Old habits." Jarvis sat down in one of the lobby chairs and looked at her. 7 months here and you never said anything." "I wasn't hiding. I was working." "You were hiding." There was no judgment in it. "I know what that looks like in you. I've seen it before." Emily finished writing a line and looked up. "I needed somewhere quiet. After Fallbrook, I know what happened at Fallbrook." The word landed between them and they both let it sit for a moment. "You saved his life," Jarvis said. Again, Different theater, same result. The attending saved his life. I identified the pattern. Don't do that. It's accurate. Emily, Jarvis leaned forward slightly. 4 years I watched you make yourself small in rooms where you were the most qualified person at the table. I am telling you right now, whatever you came here to work through, whatever reason you had for going quiet, today it ends. You understand me? Emily closed the notebook. Across the lobby, Kyle Bennett was talking quietly and urgently to Priscilla Odom. Odom's face was carefully neutral in the way it is when a person is internally making a list. The kind of list that, once started, tends to grow. Emily understood. She looked down at her left sleeve. She didn't push it up. She didn't need to. She knew what was there. The lobby was still buzzing, staff moving, monitors beeping, the senator's security detail finally letting themselves look relieved. And in the middle of all of it, a door that Emily Carter had been very carefully keeping closed for 7 months had just been opened from the outside. What was behind it was going to be very difficult for certain people to explain away. What was behind it was going to be very difficult for certain people to explain away. Priscilla Odom was the first to move. She crossed the lobby with the deliberate pace of someone who had made a decision and was now executing it before the decision could be argued with. She didn't go to Bennett. She went to the senator's security detail, a compact man named Garrett who wore the particular expression of someone paid to notice everything and react to very little. And she spoke to him quietly for about 45 seconds. Garrett listened, nodded once, and made a call on his radio. Bennett watched this from 12 feet away and did not like what he was seeing. He intercepted Odom on her way back. What did you tell them? That we'd make ourselves fully available for any follow-up. She met his eyes. Which we will. Priscilla, Kyle. Her voice was even. Careful. The voice of someone threading a needle they've threaded before, but in the dark this time. That man on the floor was a sitting United States senator. The nurse who identified his condition has military medical credentials we apparently didn't review very thoroughly when we hired her, and there are 3 people from Army Medical Command standing in our lobby right now. She paused. This is not a moment for managing. This is a moment for listening. She walked away. Bennett stayed where he was. His jaw was set and his eyes were doing the thing they did when he was recalculating. Fast, lateral, looking for the angle that still worked. There wasn't one. Not yet. But he was looking. Emily didn't see any of this. She had moved with Jarvis and the 2 medical officers. Jarvis had introduced them as Captain Reeves and Warrant Officer Pack to a small family consultation room off the main corridor, where the senator's personal physician had joined them to go over the treatment timeline. The physician, a man named Dr. Elliot Chow, had flown in from the senator's home state and had the tight expression of someone who had been kept out of his patient's care for the last 2 hours by geography and was still deciding how to feel about that. Chow reviewed the talks panel results, the administered treatment, the current vitals. He asked 3 questions, all of them sharp and technically specific. Emily answered 2 of them before Voss could. Chow looked at her. You made the organophosphate call initially? Yes. Based on what presentation markers? She listed them. Expiratory wheeze pattern, nail bed perfusion inconsistency, the metabolic odor she'd clocked in the first 40 seconds, the fact that the arrhythmia had appeared too rapidly after symptom onset for a purely cardiac origin in a man with no prior cardiac history. Chow was quiet for a moment. His file shows no cardiac history, he said. That's not public information. I didn't know his file. I made the assessment from observation. He looked at her for another moment. Then he looked at Jarvis. Something passed between them. Not warmth exactly, but recognition. The acknowledgement that passes between people who understand what a particular kind of competence costs. All right, Chow said. He turned back to the vitals monitor. Walk me through the atropine administration sequence. They spent 40 minutes in that room. When they came out, the lobby had settled into a different configuration. The immediate emergency energy had burned off, leaving behind the slower, more complicated atmosphere of institutional aftermath. Staff moved with purpose, but less urgency. A hospital communications officer was in conversation with someone from the senator's office near the main desk. Garrett, the security detail lead, had been joined by 2 colleagues who were conducting a quiet, systematic review of the lobby's access points. Reeves, the Army captain, fell into step beside Emily as they crossed the lobby. He was 35, dark-haired, and had the particular economy of movement that comes from years of operating in spaces where excess was a liability. "You should have stayed in," he said. Not accusatory, just a fact delivered in the tone of someone who had been thinking about it. "I know," Emily said. "Jarvis missed you. Didn't say so, but I know that too." He nodded. "What happened at Fallbrook? It wasn't Reeves." She said it quietly, a door closing. "Not here." He let it drop. That was the thing about people who had worked in the field with her. They knew which doors to let stay shut, at least for now. The senator's room had been moved to the 5th floor, a private suite used for high-security patients, and by early afternoon the corridor outside it had the contained, watchful quality of a space that had been quietly claimed by people who did this sort of thing professionally. Emily had no reason to be up there, and didn't go. She went back to Building C. She sat in the small, underfurnished office that served as Building C's administrative hub, and pulled out her incident notebook and added 4 more lines of detail she'd remembered. The precise sequence of the senator's responses during the atropine administration, a note about a faint tremor in his left hand that had resolved by 10:20, the specific quality of his color change in the 12 minutes between her initial assessment and the tox results. She wrote in the compressed shorthand she'd developed during her second deployment, which was fast enough to be nearly real-time and legible only to her. Then she sat back and looked at the ceiling. The door opened without a knock. Bennett. He'd collected himself in the hours since the lobby. His jacket was rebuttoned. His expression had the particular quality of professionally managed aggression. Still present, still operational, but wrapped in the language of administration. "I wanted to check in," he said. Emily looked at him. "About what?" He moved into the room without being invited and positioned himself slightly to the side of the desk. Not behind it, not in front of it. A place of lateral authority. She'd seen the move before on different continents with different people, and it meant the same thing everywhere. "Today was an unusual situation," he said. "The hospital responded appropriately, and the patient is stable. That's what matters. Okay? What I want to make sure is that there's no confusion about how we move forward." He rested one hand on the back of the chair across from her. Not sitting, hovering. "You're still under a personnel review. This morning's events don't change that." Emily considered several responses. She chose the most accurate one. "Are you here to tell me something specific, or are you establishing that you're still the person giving instructions?" The corner of his mouth tightened. "I'm making sure we're aligned." "I understand where I stand," she said. "Was there something else?" He looked at her the way he had in the cafeteria, trying to locate the angle, the vulnerability, the place where pressure would get purchase. He'd found it with almost everyone he'd ever targeted, the ones who got uncomfortable, who started self-explaining, who tripped over their need to be understood. Emily gave him nothing. She sat in her chair and looked at him with the same quality of attention she brought to a patient assessment, present, precise, entirely without performance. "You had a conversation with Colonel Jarvis," he said. "Yes. She's someone you know from your previous work?" "She's someone I served with. The military background, it wasn't detailed in your application materials." Emily said, "Everything in my application was accurate. That's not what My service record is available through official request channels if the hospital has questions about it. I'd recommend having HR make that request through the appropriate procedure." She picked up her pen. "If there's nothing else." He was still for a moment. Then he said, "There's a staff meeting Thursday. Department heads and senior coordinators. I'd like you to attend and present a summary of this morning's incident from your perspective." It was not a request, though it was dressed as one. Emily recognized what it actually was. An opportunity for Bennett to manage the narrative in a room he controlled, with an audience that was loyal to him, in a format that would let him reframe what had happened until it looked more like a protocol deviation than a life saved. "I'll check my schedule," she said. He left. She put her pen down and looked at the door for a moment. Then she picked up her phone and sent a text to a number she hadn't used in 7 months. It said, "I need to tell you some things. When are you free?" The response came back in 4 minutes. "Tomorrow, 700. I'll come to you." Jarvis arrived at the Harlow Falls Diner 2 blocks from Riverside at 6:58 a.m. She was already in a booth when Emily walked in, which meant she'd been there probably 20 minutes, which was classic Jarvis. She'd ordered coffee for both of them and was reading something on her phone that she put away when Emily sat down. "You look tired," Jarvis said. "I am tired." "You sleeping?" "Enough." Jarvis wrapped both hands around her mug. "Tell me about this place, the real version." Emily looked out the window. The street was doing its early morning thing. Delivery trucks, a few pedestrians moving fast against the cold, the garbage truck making its grinding progress down the block. "It's a good hospital in a lot of ways," she said. "The nursing staff on nights are solid. The equipment is decent. Administration is—" She paused. "Bennett runs it like a property he owns, not a medical facility he's responsible for." I gathered. "How much did you get from Odom?" "Enough to have questions." Jarvis's eyes sharpened. "He filed a personnel action against you. Before this. Performance review, reassignment to Building C. For what?" "I sat at the wrong table at a breakfast event. The divider was down." Jarvis's expression didn't change, which was its own kind of change. "Emily, I know. You saved that man's life, and you're under a personnel review." "I was under the review before that. Yesterday just made it complicated for him to proceed quietly." "Complicated," Jarvis said. "Yes, I'd say." She set down her mug. "Reeves pulled your service record last night. Not for me. For the Senator's team. They asked." Emily went still. "It's a good record," Jarvis said. "An exceptional record. You know what it says." "I know what it says. 3 deployments, 2 theater commendations, primary trauma responder for special operations medical support across 14 months in a combat zone, 12 documented life-critical interventions with survivable outcomes." She paused. "Fallbrook." The diner moved around them. A waitress refilled the coffee without being asked. "Fallbrook was a discharge," Emily said. "Medical. Fallbrook was a breakdown in institutional support that you paid for personally," Jarvis said. "There's a difference, and the record reflects that now. It's been updated. It took 2 years and it shouldn't have taken that long, and I want you to know that I know that." Emily looked down at her coffee. There was something that moved in her chest. Not quite gratitude, not quite grief. Something older than either of those things. "Why are you still here?" she asked. "Harlow Falls. You didn't come for the Senator specifically. You were already en route before it happened." Jarvis was quiet for a moment. "I was coming to find you," she said. "Reeves tracked you down 2 weeks ago. I was deciding how to approach it." She turned her mug in a slow circle. "There's a position, training development, trauma protocols, specifically for forward surgical unit preparation. It would be based in a stateside facility, no deployment requirement. It would be—" She stopped. "It's exactly what you should be doing." Emily didn't answer immediately. "You've been at this hospital for 7 months," Jarvis continued, "in a surgical recovery unit on nights, filing other people's paperwork, and apparently getting publicly humiliated by a man who doesn't know your first name as well as he knows your employee ID number. This is not where you belong." "I know where I belong," Emily said quietly. "I've been figuring out where that is." "And?" "I'm not done figuring." Jarvis looked at her for a long moment. She had the patience of a person who had spent decades operating in situations where pushing too hard was as dangerous as not pushing enough. "All right," she said. "But the offer is real, and it has a window. Think about it." They sat with that for a few minutes. The diner filled up gradually. Morning shift workers, a couple with a stroller, a table of older men who clearly had a regular. Normal life moving forward in its ordinary increments. "Bennett is going to try to use the Thursday meeting against you," Emily said. It wasn't a question. "I know. Odom told me about it last night." "You've been talking to Odom." "She reached out. She has concerns about Bennett that predate you. Significant ones." Jarvis chose her next words carefully. "There are things in motion that are not entirely about you, Emily. You should know that. What happened yesterday accelerated something that was already starting to move." Emily absorbed this. "What kind of things?" The kind that will require documentation, witness accounts. Anything you have in writing about how he's treated staff, not just you, will matter. Emily thought about the small notebook she kept. The habit she'd never broken from deployment, when everything you observed got written down because memory under pressure was unreliable and the record outlasted the moment. She'd kept one here. She'd been keeping it since her first week, not because she'd anticipated needing it, but because stopping felt like losing a part of herself she wasn't willing to lose. She thought about what was in it. "I'll need to organize some things," she said. "Organize them carefully," Jarvis said, "and don't give them to anyone except someone with institutional authority to receive them." "Who has that authority right now?" "More people than Bennett realizes," Jarvis said. Thursday came with a particular weight of days that have been loaded in advance. Emily arrived at the administrative conference room on the 4th floor at 3 minutes before the scheduled start of the meeting and took a seat at the far end of the table. Not the seat she'd been implicitly assigned by Bennett's arrangement of the room, which placed her in the middle, visible from all sides, in the position of someone presenting a report. She pulled out her notebook, set it on the table, and waited. Bennett noticed. His eyes went to her position, then to the notebook, then back to her face. He didn't say anything. The room filled, 6 department heads, 4 senior coordinators, 2 administrative directors who reported to Bennett. Priscilla Odom came in last and sat 3 seats away from Emily, which was not where she usually sat. Greg Tullis came in behind her and took the chair nearest the door with the slightly hunched posture of a man who wished he could continue through the door and not stop. "I want to start with Monday," Bennett said. He stood at the head of the table with a hand on the back of the chair, which he hadn't pulled out. A power position. Deliberate. "What happened in that lobby was an emergency that the hospital responded to. The senator is recovering well and his team has expressed appreciation for the care provided. That's the headline." Murmurs of agreement. "What I want to address," he continued, "is the question of protocol. When an off-unit staff member responds to an emergency without being formally dispatched, we have a liability question regardless of outcome. I want to make sure we're clear on that as a standard." One of the department heads, Dr. Yolanda Marsh, who ran internal medicine and had approximately 17 years of institutional memory, said carefully, "Are we talking about a specific staff member?" "We're talking about the protocol," Bennett said. "Off-unit response requires authorization unless the situation is immediately life-threatening and no authorized staff are present." "Authorized staff were present," said a voice from the end of the table. Everyone turned. Emily had not planned to speak this early, but the statement Bennett had just made was factually incorrect, and she had a deep, almost physical inability to let factually incorrect statements stand in rooms where they would be treated as the record. "I was in Building C when the emergency call came through," she said. "The radio request specifically asked for any available trauma-certified staff. I'm trauma-certified. The lobby had 3 physicians present when I arrived, none of whom had yet identified the causative agent. I made an assessment. I shared it. Dr. Voss made the treatment decision." She held Bennett's gaze across the table. "That is an accurate account of the sequence." Silence. Bennett said, "That's one way to characterize it." "It's what happened," she said. "The issue isn't whether you made a useful contribution. The issue is whether you followed proper protocol for off-unit response." "I followed the radio request," she said. "I can show you the dispatch log." He didn't expect that. She saw it in the small pause, the recalibration. He'd assumed she wouldn't have documentation. The notebook on the table, the physical presence of it, was doing work simply by being there. "This isn't the time for that level of detail," he said. "I have it if it's needed." She picked up the notebook and turned it over in her hands once, and then put it back down, which was not accidental. Marsh cleared her throat. "Kyle, maybe we table the protocol discussion until we have a more complete picture of the dispatch record. For now, I think the relevant fact is that the patient survived and the hospital's response, taken as a whole, was appropriate." One of the other heads, a man named Ferris from Surgical Services, nodded. "I think that's right." Bennett said nothing. He moved to the next item on his agenda, but the room had shifted. Emily could feel it. The specific atmospheric change of a group of people revising their understanding of a situation mid-meeting. It wasn't dramatic. It was the small-scale version of the thing that had happened in the lobby, a reorientation, quiet and irreversible. After the meeting, as people filed out, Odom fell into step beside Emily in the corridor. "He's going to escalate," Odom said. Her voice was low, matter-of-fact. Not a warning. An observation from someone who had been watching this longer. "I know." "The personnel review. He'll push it through before the end of the week, if he can. Reassignment isn't enough for him now. He'll want termination." Emily kept walking. "He can file whatever he wants." "Emily." Odom stopped. Emily stopped too. "I want to be clear about something. I have been in this hospital for 11 years. I've watched him do this to 6 people that I know of. 2 of them were nurses. Both of them left. Both of them were good." She paused. "I didn't do enough to stop it before. I'm trying to be more useful now." Emily looked at her. Priscilla Odom was not, she had concluded, a bad person. She was a person who had made the calculations that institutions train their people to make, and she had made them in Bennett's favor for long enough that she was now looking at the accumulated cost of that and not liking the number. "I have documentation," Emily said. "Observations I've kept since I arrived. Incidents involving other staff as well. Things I noticed." Odom absorbed this. "Who else knows? Right now, Colonel Jarvis?" "I need to make some calls," Odom said. "Give me until tomorrow morning." She walked away. Emily watched her go and then continued down the corridor toward the elevator, and she was almost at the call button when Greg Tullis appeared from the stairwell door to her left. He was breathing slightly harder than the one flight of stairs would explain. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Greg. He's already sent the termination paperwork." He said it in a rush, like he'd been holding it, and it had become too heavy. "I saw it this afternoon. It's going to HR tonight. The grounds are repeated protocol violations and insubordination, and he's backdated the documentation to last week." He stopped and pressed his lips together. "I signed off on part of it. He looked away. "I need you to know I signed off on it before I understood what was in it. He gave me a stack of things during a busy morning and told me they were routine staffing documents." Emily studied him. He was telling the truth. She could see it in the specific quality of his distress, not the manufactured discomfort of someone managing a situation, but the raw, slightly nauseating guilt of someone who had been used and had just understood how. "Did you make a copy?" she said. "No. I should have. Greg." She waited until he looked at her. "Do you have access to the HR system?" "Yes." "Is the document submitted yet or still in process?" He pulled out his phone with hands that were not quite steady and checked something. "Still in queue," he said. "It won't process until morning." "Then there's time," she thought quickly. "I need you to do something that's going to feel uncomfortable. I need you to go back to your office and write down everything you just told me in a factual, chronological account. What document you signed, when, what you were told it was, what you now believe it was. Sign and date it. Print 2 copies, put one in your own file, and give one to Priscilla Odom." He stared at her. If Bennett finds out, he's already used you once," she said. "I'm asking you to decide if you want to let that stand." The elevator came. She got in. She didn't watch him to see what he decided. She'd done what she could, and the rest was his. The termination notice arrived by email at 7:04 a.m. Friday. Emily read it on her phone sitting on the edge of her bed before she'd made coffee. The language was clipped and bureaucratic. Ongoing failure to adhere to established protocol, insubordination on multiple documented occasions, conduct unbecoming of staff at this institution. The effective date was listed as that day. She was instructed to return her badge and access card to HR by noon. She read it twice. Then she put her phone face down on the nightstand and sat there for a moment. There was a version of this moment she'd experienced before, the one that hits in the middle of the night in a phobie, after a decision that can't be walked back, when you're running on bad coffee and adrenaline, and the thing you're most afraid of is not that you made the wrong call, but that the right call is going to cost something you can't afford to lose. She had learned in those moments to breathe once and then move. Not to process, not to feel the full weight of it right away. Move. She made coffee. She organized 3 notebooks, not all of them, just the 3 most relevant, and took a photo of each page and uploaded them to a secure cloud folder whose existence she hadn't mentioned to anyone. She sent Jarvis a text that said only, "It happened." Friday morning. She made a second call to a number she'd found in a military legal support directory 2 weeks ago when she'd first started to suspect where things were heading, and left a message for a JAG affiliated legal advocate who worked with veterans in civilian employment disputes. Then she dressed, put the notebooks in her bag, and drove to Riverside Medical Center. Not to turn in her badge. Not yet. She was walking through the main entrance at 8:15 when her phone buzzed. The text was from Odom. "Board chair is aware. Emergency governance meeting called for 10 a.m. Do not leave the building." Emily stopped in the middle of the lobby. The same lobby where, 4 days ago, she'd crouched next to a man on the floor and made the call that had unraveled everything, and looked at the message. She looked up at the atrium ceiling, the flat gray October light coming through the glass, and something moved through her that she didn't perform and didn't try to manage. It was not triumph. It was closer to the feeling you get when a thing you've been bracing for finally arrives. Not relief exactly, but the particular solidity of ground under your feet after you've been waiting a long time to know where the floor is. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a number she didn't recognize. She picked up. A man's voice, slightly hoarse, the quality of someone who had recently been very ill and was still calibrating. "Is this Emily Carter?" "Yes." "This is Marcus Aldrin." A pause. "I was told you were the one who—" "You don't need to thank me," she said. "I know I don't need to." His voice had a dryness to it, the humor of a man who was used to people telling him what he needed. "I'm doing it anyway. Can you come upstairs? There are some people here who want to talk to you." She looked at the elevator bank, then at the entrance, then at the text from Odom still open on her screen. "I can be up in 5 minutes," she said. She crossed the lobby and pressed the button for the 5th floor. And when the doors opened, she walked out into a corridor that was much more occupied than it had any right to be at 8:20 on a Friday morning. Jarvis was there. Reeves was there. Chow, the senator's physician. 2 people she didn't recognize in civilian clothes who stood with the careful stillness of people who knew how to look like they weren't watching everything. And at the end of the corridor, coming around the corner with a phone pressed to his ear and an expression like a man who has just been informed that the ground has moved beneath him, was Kyle Bennett. He saw her. He stopped walking. The phone stayed pressed to his ear for another second before he lowered it slowly. His face ran through several configurations. Disbelief, calculation, something that might have been, briefly, the precursor to panic, before it settled into the careful blankness of a man who is deciding, in real time, whether there is still a play available to him. Emily looked at him across 30 feet of hospital corridor. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. She walked toward the senator's room and let the door open around her, and Kyle Bennett stood in the corridor behind her with his phone in his hand and the sound of the governance meeting being scheduled somewhere above him, and the particular quality of a Friday morning that had decided, entirely without his input, what kind of day it was going to be. She walked toward the senator's room and let the door open around her, and Kyle Bennett stood in the corridor behind her with his phone in his hand and the sound of the governance meeting being scheduled somewhere above him, and the particular quality of a Friday morning that had decided, entirely without his input, what kind of day it was going to be. The room was larger than standard, which it needed to be. Senator Marcus Aldrin was sitting up in the bed at an angle that suggested he'd been pushing for more upright and had compromised with his medical team somewhere around 45 degrees. He was 63, silver-haired, with the kind of face that had spent decades being looked at, and had developed a quality of deliberate openness over whatever was actually going on underneath. He looked better than a man who'd been on a lobby floor 48 hours ago had any right to look. He also looked tired in the specific way that health scares produce. Not physically depleted, but recalibrated, the way people get when something has reminded them that the body keeps its own ledger. He saw Emily, and something in his expression shifted. Not gratitude exactly. He'd been thanked for things and thanked others for things enough times that the ritual of it had worn smooth. This was more specific. The look of a person seeing the actual person behind a story they'd been told. Sit down, he said. Please. She sat. Jarvis stayed near the window. Chow was at the monitoring station reviewing something on a tablet. The two people Emily didn't recognize positioned themselves near the door in a way that was not accidental. My chief of staff briefed me this morning, Aldrin said, about the situation with your employment. He didn't elaborate, which told her he'd been briefed well. I want to understand it from you directly. There's a termination notice in the HR queue, she said, effective today. On what grounds? Protocol violations and insubordination. The documentation was generated after Monday's incident and backdated. He watched her. You can demonstrate that. Yes. And there's a governance meeting this morning. At 10. I was told not to leave the building. Aldrin was quiet for a moment. He turned his head slightly toward the two people by the door. Get Hartwell on the phone, he said to one of them, and pull whatever you need from the HR system before 10. He looked back at Emily. I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I'd like a direct answer. All right? Your service record. Jarvis walked me through most of it last night. There's a period, about 14 months, listed under a different classification than your other deployments. I know enough to read the category. I don't know the specifics. Do I need to? Emily looked at him. The room was very quiet. No, she said, not for the purpose of this morning. He accepted that. People who had operated at his level had learned to understand which doors needed opening and which ones to leave alone. Then I'll ask you one more. When you identified what was wrong with me on Monday, how long did that actually take you? From crouching next to you to conclusion? About 40 seconds. He absorbed that the way you absorb a number that is both smaller and larger than you expected. 40 seconds, he repeated. The indicators were clear once I was close enough. The difficulty was that they weren't pointing where everyone else was looking. He nodded slowly. That seems to be a recurring dynamic, he said, and there was something in his voice that was dry and exact and not entirely about his own medical situation. Jarvis moved away from the window. Emily, the meeting is in 90 minutes. We need to prep. Set. The governance meeting had been called by the board chair, a woman named Doris Halstead, who had built a commercial real estate portfolio in Harlow Falls over 30 years and served on the Riverside board for 6 of them. She was 71, small, with white hair cut close to her head, and the manner of a person who had long ago stopped performing patients she didn't feel. She ran the meeting from the head of the table in the 6th-floor boardroom with the efficiency of someone who understood that the longer these things ran, the more time there was for people to start negotiating. Bennett was present. He'd arrived 3 minutes early, which Emily noted, and had positioned himself in the chair to Halstead's immediate left, a seat that communicated proximity to authority. He had a folder in front of him, closed, and the expression of a man who had spent the last 2 hours reconstructing his argument and believed he had found solid ground. He had not found solid ground. He didn't know that yet. Odom was present, Voss was present, 2 board members Emily didn't know, and a hospital attorney named Sutter who was 32 and had the tight, slightly damp look of someone who had been called in on short notice and hadn't been briefed thoroughly enough. Jarvis was present as an institutional representative, which technically required Halstead's invitation, which Halstead had provided without explanation at 8:45 that morning. Emily sat at the far end of the table again. Old habit. The seat that lets you see everyone and requires nobody to look at you unless they choose to. Halstead opened without preamble. We have a situation that involves a personnel action, a patient outcome, and a question of institutional credibility. I want to deal with all 3, and I want to do it this morning. She looked at Bennett. Kyle. The termination notice was filed appropriately, he said, under HR Policy 14C, which governs repeated protocol violations. The documentation was backdated, Odom said. The room sharpened. Bennett turned to look at her with an expression that was almost perfectly controlled. Priscilla, Greg Tullis, signed a portion of the supporting documentation under the belief that it was routine staffing paperwork, Odom said. He has provided a written account of that to the board, submitted this morning at 7:50. The account includes dates, the context in which the documents were presented to him, and his understanding of their content at the time of signing. Sutter, the attorney, made a note. The documentation was not backdated, Bennett said. It reflects the sequence of events as they occurred. The sequence of events as they occurred, Voss said from across the table, and his voice had something in it that Emily hadn't heard before, a controlled precision, the voice of a man who has decided to stop managing his discomfort and say the actual thing. Includes a staff nurse correctly identifying a critical patient's condition when 2 board-certified physicians, including myself, had not yet done so. I want that on the record. Silence. Halstead wrote something. Harlan, Bennett said, I'm not going to sit here and watch a personnel action proceed against someone who did her job better than I did mine on Monday, Voss said. He wasn't loud, he wasn't performing, he was just saying it. Whatever else is in that folder, that's the context. Bennett's jaw tightened. He opened the folder. There are 6 documented protocol deviations in Carter's file since her arrival. I'd like to see those documents, Jarvis said. You're not... Colonel Jarvis is here at my request as an institutional representative of Army Medical Command, Halstead said evenly. Please extend her whatever access you're offering the board. Bennett looked at Halstead. Something moved behind his eyes, the specific look of a man who has just registered that the room he thought he controlled has different walls than he'd measured. He slid the folder down the table. Jarvis opened it, read the first page, and turned it so Emily could see. Emily looked at it. The first documented deviation was dated 4 weeks ago. It described an incident in which she had exceeded her nursing scope by providing unsolicited diagnostic commentary to an attending physician. She remembered the incident. A post-op patient in room 6 had been developing the early indicators of a pulmonary embolism. She'd flagged it to the attending. He'd ordered the imaging. The imaging confirmed it. The patient had received treatment within the hour. She looked up and found Bennett watching her. The attending in that case, she said, was Dr. Ferris. He ordered the imaging based on my assessment. The patient survived a potential PE because of a 20-minute intervention window we would not have had otherwise. She paused. I can pull the chart. You don't need to, Ferris said from the doorway. Everyone turned. He was standing at the threshold with his badge clipped to his jacket and the expression of a man who had decided something on the walk over. I was informed about this meeting this morning, he said to Halstead. I came because 2 of those 6 documented deviations involve my patients and my decisions. In both cases, Carter's assessment was accurate, my clinical decision to act on it was appropriate, and the outcomes were good. If those are being characterized as protocol violations, I want to understand by whose standard. Halstead looked at Bennett. Kyle. The folder was still open in front of Jarvis. Bennett did not reach for it. There was a quality to the silence in that room that Emily had felt before, in different configurations. The silence of a situation that has moved past the point where management is possible and is now simply revealing itself. You couldn't accelerate it. You couldn't slow it down. You could only stay present in it and let it run its course. I want a full HR audit, Halstead said. Her voice was even and final. All personnel actions filed under Bennett's authority in the last 3 years. I want it on my desk by end of business Monday. She looked at Sutter. I want that termination notice suspended pending the audit. Sutter nodded. And I want this room cleared except for board members in 5 minutes. It was a dismissal. A clean, irrevocable one. People began to move. Odom gathered her things. Voss pushed back from the table. Ferris, who had technically never sat down, stepped back from the doorway to let people pass. Bennett did not immediately move. He sat at the table with his folder and his careful posture and the expression of a man running rapid internal calculations on a problem that keeps returning different numbers. He looked, for the first time since Emily had known of his existence, genuinely uncertain. Not about his position. He'd lost that ground, and some part of him knew it. Uncertain about something larger, the kind of uncertainty that hits when a person who has always understood themselves as the one who decides things begins to suspect that other people have been deciding things around them for longer than they realized. Emily was almost at the door when Halstead said, Ms. Carter. She turned. The termination notice is suspended, Halstead said. You still have a job here. For now, report to your original unit. A pause. And I'll need your incident notebooks, all of them. Properly chain of custody transferred to our legal team. I have 3 relevant ones. Emily said. "And a digital backup." "Good." Emily nodded and walked out. In the corridor, Jarvis fell into step beside her. They walked in silence for a moment. "That went better than it had any right to," Jarvis said. "It went the way evidence goes," Emily said. "When you have it." They reached the elevator. Jarvis pressed the button and they stood waiting, and the building moved around them, pages going over the intercom, a cart rattling past on the linoleum, the ordinary machinery of a hospital that had no idea that the sixth floor had just shifted everything. "He's not done," Emily said. "No," Jarvis agreed. "He's not. He's going to go through HR, try to find a different angle, something before the audit is complete." "Probably. There's something else." Emily kept her voice level. "One of the documents in that folder, the second deviation notation, it mentioned a witness account from a staff member in surgical recovery, someone who provided a statement about my conduct on a night shift 3 weeks ago." She paused. "I want to know who it was." Jarvis looked at her. "Why?" "Because the incident it describes didn't happen." She turned to meet Jarvis's eyes. "Someone gave a fabricated account, and they did it recently enough to be added to a file that was supposedly documenting months of violations." The elevator opened. They stepped in. "That's not just Bennett managing a problem," Emily said. "That's someone working with him, someone on the night staff who had reason to access my schedule, my unit, and enough details about my work patterns to make the account sound plausible." The doors closed. Jarvis was very still for a moment. "Emily," she said, "if there's a witness who gave a false statement in support of a fabricated personnel action, that's not just an employment issue." "No," Emily said. "It's not." The elevator descended. Emily's mind was already moving through the night shift roster. The faces, the patterns, the small behavioral tells she'd been cataloging since her first week without knowing she was doing it. The person who had always been slightly too casual when she walked past. The person who volunteered information about shift schedules they didn't need to know. The person who had, on 2 separate occasions, asked her questions about her previous work with a specificity that hadn't seemed like curiosity at the time and seemed like something else now. The elevator opened on the 2nd floor. Emily stepped out, and she was 3 steps down the corridor when her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number containing 6 words and no signature. She stopped walking. She read the message again. Then she looked up at the corridor. The empty, ordinary, fluorescent-lit corridor of a hospital she had been trying to disappear inside for 7 months, and understood that whatever she had been running from had not stayed where she'd left it. It had followed her here, and it had just announced itself. It had followed her here, and it had just announced itself. The message read, "You should have stayed gone. This isn't over for you." 6 words and a period. No name, no number she recognized. The timestamp was 10:47 a.m., which meant it had been sent while she was still in the boardroom, which meant whoever sent it had known she was there. She forwarded it to Jarvis without comment and kept walking. The thing about threats delivered by text is that they reveal more than they intend to. This one told her 3 things immediately. The sender knew her number, which was not publicly listed and had only been given to hospital HR and a small number of colleagues. The sender knew she'd been in that meeting, which narrowed the field to someone with access to the building's information flow. And the sender was rattled enough to move before they had a plan, which meant they were reacting rather than operating. Reactive people made mistakes. She'd seen it enough times to trust the pattern. Jarvis caught up to her at the surgical recovery unit entrance. "I saw it," Jarvis said. "Who has my number in this building?" "HR file, which Bennett has access to." Jarvis paused. "And anyone Bennett shared it with." "I need the night shift roster for surgical recovery, 3 weeks back." "I can get it through Odom." "Get it before noon." Jarvis nodded once and turned back toward the elevator. Emily pushed through the recovery unit doors. The unit had the particular quality of a space that had been aware of something without being told. The specific atmospheric tension of a workplace that runs on internal communication faster than any official channel. The nurses at the station looked up when she came in. Some of them quickly looked back down. A few held her gaze. One of them, a woman named Petra, who worked the overlap shift and had once lent Emily a compression bandage without being asked and never mentioned it again, gave a small, precise nod that meant something Emily accepted. She pulled up her assignment board. She was back on her original unit per Halstead's instruction, which meant she had patients. She had work. Good. Work was the thing that organized everything else around it. She had 3 post-op patients on the board, all of them from procedures the previous day, all of them in the standard recovery window. She checked the charts, updated through the night shift, nothing flagged, and did her rounds in the order that made clinical sense rather than the order the board suggested, which was a habit she'd never broken and that had caught 3 things in her first month that the board sequence would have missed. Room 3 was a 58-year-old man named Dwight, who'd had a bowel resection and was trying to negotiate his pain medication schedule with the pharmacological ambition of someone who had strong opinions about the subject. She spent 11 minutes with him, more than scheduled, less than he wanted, and left with his vitals charted and his expectations slightly recalibrated. Room 5 was a woman in her early 40s, knee replacement, doing well, whose primary concern was whether she'd make her daughter's school play in 12 days. Emily checked her flexion progress, gave her an honest number, and watched the woman's face do the math. Room 7 was the one she'd been mentally saving. A 19-year-old named Caleb, post-appendectomy, 22 hours out, who had developed a low-grade fever overnight that the night shift had documented, but not escalated. Emily read the night shift note, fever 99.8, patient resting, will monitor, and looked at Caleb, who was awake and had the particular flatness of someone who hadn't slept despite technically being in bed for 8 hours. "How's the pain?" she asked. "Manageable." He said it like someone who had been told to say manageable. "On a scale." 6, maybe. "Where?" He pointed. She palpated carefully, watched his face rather than the sight, and found what she was looking for in the catch of his breath at a location slightly lateral to the incision. She checked the drain output, compared it to the overnight record, and made a note. "Has anyone talked to you about the fever?" Night nurse said it was normal. "It can be. I want doctor Ferris to take a look this morning just to check something, okay?" He nodded. He was scared, she could see that. 19 and alone, his parents were 3 hours away and had driven home the previous evening, planning to return on the weekend, and trying to perform the kind of cooperative calm that he thought was expected of him. "It's probably nothing to worry about," she said, "but I'd rather have Ferris look at it than skip it. That's me being careful, not me being alarmed." "Okay," Caleb said. Less flat this time. She put in the consult request and moved on. It was 11:40 when her phone buzzed with a text from Odom. Roster attached. Also, "You need to see something. My office. Now, if possible." My desk. Odom's office was on the 3rd floor, a small room that smelled like old coffee, and the particular brand of air freshener that institutions buy in bulk. She was standing when Emily came in, which meant she'd been pacing. "Close the door," Odom said. Emily closed it. The HR audit started this morning. Halstead moved fast. She had the external auditor on site by 10:30. Odom turned her monitor around so Emily could see the screen. They pulled Bennett's personnel action history going back 3 years, 41 files flagged for review, 14 terminations, 9 forced resignations. She paused to let that number land. Of those 23 departures, 17 involved staff who had raised compliance concerns, filed internal complaints, or were in some way positioned as problems for Bennett's administrative agenda. Emily looked at the screen. The pattern was visible without analysis. You could see it in the dates, the clustering, the way certain file notations repeated across different names, the way form language repeats when someone is copying from a template. 2 of those nurses, Odom said, filed external complaints after leaving. One with the state health department, one directly with the hospital board. Both complaints were resolved without action. She folded her arms. The board member who handled both resolutions was on Bennett's standing budget committee. Who's the board member? Raymond Cho. He retired from the board 8 months ago. Halstead told me this morning she was already aware there were questions about his tenure. Odom pulled the monitor back. The point is, Bennett has been doing this for years. Systematically. And the system around him absorbed it. Emily sat down in the chair across from the desk. She thought about the 2 nurses Odom had mentioned, women she'd never met, whose names were in a file somewhere, who had left this building with their complaints unresolved and their careers altered. She thought about what it had cost them to file those complaints at all. "The fabricated witness account," Emily said. "In my file. Has the auditor pulled it?" "Yes, and there's a problem." Odom sat down. "The account is attributed to a night shift LPN named Darren Wolf. He's been on the surgical recovery unit for 2 years. I checked his employment record this morning. He took 2 personal days last week, which is when the document was filed. He's back on shift tonight." Emily had the roster open on her phone. She found Wolf's name. She knew him by face, had worked alongside him without incident on 4 or 5 occasions. Quiet. Efficient. The type of person who occupies a space without leaving much impression. She ran back through her memory of him, the way she'd learned to run back through terrain, looking for the things she'd registered peripherally without cataloging. The questions about her schedule. Twice. The time she'd come back to the nursing station for her forgotten notebook and found him standing near her locker with no obvious reason to be there, who had said something about checking the supply rack and moved away before she could think too hard about it. "Has anyone talked to him?" she said. "Not yet. The auditor knows the account exists. They don't know the specifics of what I just told you." "Don't approach him before the auditor does," Emily said. "If he thinks he's been identified, he'll alter his account or disappear." "I know." Odom hesitated. "There's one more thing." Emily waited. Wolf was hired on Bennett's direct recommendation. Lateral transfer from a facility in another county. I pulled that facility's records through our HR network this morning. She opened a folder on her desk and turned it toward Emily. "That facility closed 14 months ago, under investigation, financial irregularities, and at least 1 complaint of staff coercion. Bennett's name appears in the administrative correspondence 3 times. The picture that assembled from these pieces was not subtle. Bennett had not acted alone. He'd built, over years, a small operational infrastructure, a board member who could absorb complaints, a staff member who could provide witness accounts, a pattern of administrative action that looked like management until you saw it at scale and it looked like something else. Emily looked at the folder for a moment. Then she looked up at Odom. "You've been collecting this for a while," she said. Odom met her eyes. "I've been collecting pieces," she said. "I didn't have a way to put them together that would hold." "What changed?" "Monday happened." A pause. "And I watched him try to terminate someone who'd just saved a man's life, and I understood that I was going to run out of time to matter on this." It was an honest thing to say. Emily recognized the specific quality of it, not heroism, not redemption arc, just a person deciding at a specific moment that the math had changed. "Give everything to the auditor," Emily said. "All of it, today." Ferris found her at the nursing station at 1:15 with the look of a man delivering news that confirmed something he'd suspected. "Caleb in room 7, he said. "Early wound dehiscence localized. We're going back in this afternoon." "How early did it start?" "My guess, 6 hours ago, maybe more. Night shift." He stopped. "Documented the fever and monitored," Emily said. "Yes." He said it carefully. Not accusation, documentation. "It was within protocol to monitor, but catching it this morning instead of this afternoon matters." "It does." He looked at her. "Good catch." He walked back toward the surgical suite. Emily updated Caleb's chart and then went to room 7 to tell him what was happening, which she did in plain, direct language without softening it into meaninglessness. He took it better than she expected. 19 and frightened, and better than she expected, which was something she'd stopped being surprised by. She was back at the station when Jarvis appeared in the unit doorway and gestured once with her chin. "Come here now. Not urgent, but don't wait." Emily met her in the corridor. "Wolf," Jarvis said. "He came in for an early shift. He's here now." "Does the auditor know?" "I just told Halstead's assistant, but there's a problem." Jarvis's voice was level, which was how it got when the information was not level. "Wolf made a call from the staff break room 20 minutes ago. The building security system logged it. Not the content, just the number. The number is registered to a prepaid device purchased 6 weeks ago." She paused. The call lasted 4 minutes. Right after he came on shift. "He knows," Emily said. "He knows something. Whether he knows the audit has his name, I can't say." If he calls Bennett, Bennett's phone has been flagged by the auditor since 10 this morning. Any outgoing communication will be logged. Jarvis folded her arms. The auditor wants to interview Wolf this afternoon. Halstead has agreed. The question is whether he comes in voluntarily or whether someone needs to locate him. He's on shift, Emily said. He's not going anywhere without being noticed. She thought for a second. Unless he's already noticed enough to make a move. They both knew what making a move looked like in this context. A sudden illness, a family emergency, a badge left at the nursing station, and a car gone from the parking structure. The institutional equivalent of a door closing quietly before anyone could reach it. I'll go back to the unit, Emily said. Petra's on today. She'll tell me if he does anything unusual. Don't send anyone to watch him. If he sees institutional attention, he'll go faster. And if he runs? Then he runs, and the auditor has his documented statement and his employment record and the prepaid phone call, and they build the case without him. She said it without heat. It's not ideal, but it's enough. Jarvis nodded. Emily went back in. The afternoon moved in the way that high-stakes afternoons move when nothing is quite breaking. Tight, incremental, every ordinary task performed with an undertow of awareness pulling against it. Caleb went into surgery at 2:30. Emily finished her rounds, updated 3 charts, fielded a question from a family member in room 3 that she answered with enough specificity that the person stopped asking and started listening. Normal work, moving forward. At 3:10, Petra appeared at her elbow with the quiet efficiency of a person who knows how to relay information without performing it. Wolf, Petra said. She didn't look directly at Emily while she talked, keeping her eyes on the board like they were having a logistical conversation. He's been in the break room twice in the last hour, longer than usual, and he asked me who was covering evening shift. What did you tell him? Standard rotation. I didn't give him names. A pause. He also asked if there was anything going on with administration today. I said I hadn't heard anything. Good. Thank you, Petra. Petra moved away with the unremarkable efficiency of someone returning to work. At 3:45, the auditor, a compact, gray-suited woman named Hess, who had been brought in from an independent firm and communicated almost entirely in the language of process, sent a formal request through hospital administration for Darren Wolf to present himself for interview at 4:15 in the compliance office on the 6th floor. The request went through the official channel, which meant it was logged, time-stamped, and delivered through the unit supervisor rather than directly to Wolf. Greg Tullis delivered it. Emily was at the other end of the nursing station when she saw Tullis approach Wolf with the paper, watched Wolf take it, watched his face do the rapid internal calculation that faces do when they receive information they've been dreading. He read it twice. He folded it. He put it in his pocket. Then he looked up and directly at Emily. The distance between them was maybe 20 feet. Long enough to read nothing specific, but close enough to read everything general. The recognition, the assessment, the decision being made in real time. Emily held his gaze without expression and without looking away. He was the first to look down. He went to the break room for the 3rd time. Emily called Jarvis. He's going to run, or he's going to call someone in the next 10 minutes. Security has the parking structure exits flagged. If his badge swipes any external door, we'll know. He might leave his badge. Then he leaves on foot through an unsecured exit, and we pull security footage. A pause. Emily, either way, let it happen. Don't intercept him. The auditor needs this clean. She knew Jarvis was right. It didn't make standing there easier. There is a particular kind of patience that is not passive, the kind that requires active restraint, the continuous decision not to move when every instinct is calibrated for movement. She had learned this patience in places where the cost of acting too early was measured in lives. She applied it now to a break room in a hospital in the upper Midwest and reminded herself that the mechanism of justice is slower than the moment that requires it, and that slow is not the same as wrong. Wolf came out of the break room at 3:58. He had his jacket on. He walked toward the unit exit at a pace calibrated to look unhurried, which was its own kind of tell. Tullis, who had been hovering near the supply room with the uncertain energy of a man who doesn't know exactly what his role is but is trying to perform it correctly, made eye contact with Emily. She gave a small, precise shake of her head. He stayed put. Wolf's badge swiped the exit at 3:59 p.m. 30 seconds later, Jarvis's text, "He's moving. Security has him. Don't worry." Emily turned back to her board. Caleb would be out of surgery in approximately 40 minutes. She had charts to update and a family in room 5 who needed a progress report. She had work to do, which was what she always had, which was the thing that had kept her functional through every version of this kind of day in every place she'd been required to have it. She did the work. Wolf made it to the second floor of the parking structure before he stopped walking. Not because security stopped him. They hadn't approached him yet, were maintaining distance per Hess's instruction, but because he'd taken out his phone, started a call, and the person on the other end had apparently said something that stopped him mid-step. She learned this later, from Jarvis, who learned it from the security supervisor's written account. What Wolf had said on that call, captured on the security system's audio log, which covered the structure's common areas, was, "He's already talking. I saw him in the building this morning." What the person on the other end said was not captured, because the call was outgoing from Wolf's personal phone rather than the flagged prepaid device. But what happened next was, Wolf ended the call, stood in the parking structure for 43 seconds, and then turned around and walked back into the hospital. He took the elevator to the 6th floor. He walked into the compliance office at 4:08 p.m., 7 minutes before his scheduled interview, and told Hess that he wanted to give a voluntary statement. He talked for 2 hours and 14 minutes. Emily didn't learn the content of that statement until the following morning, when Odom called her at 7 a.m. with a voice that had the quality of someone who had not slept well but had resolved something while not sleeping. The statement, Odom told her, covered 3 years. Wolf had been placed at Riverside by Bennett specifically to perform a function, to monitor staff members Bennett identified as problems and provide witness accounts when needed. He had done this for 4 people before Emily. 2 of the accounts had been used in successful termination proceedings. 1 had been used in a forced resignation. 1 had been filed and held in reserve and never used because the staff member had left voluntarily first. For Emily, Wolf said, he had been asked to provide an account almost immediately after Bennett flagged her file following the cafeteria incident. He'd been given specific language, not invented wholesale, but scaffolded on real observations about Emily's work patterns, real incidents she'd been involved in, altered just enough to read as a protocol deviation rather than a clinical intervention. He knew the account was false. He had filed it because Bennett had told him that his own employment was contingent on his continued usefulness, and he had believed it. He had, Odom said, started crying approximately 40 minutes into the statement. Emily listened to all of this without interrupting. When Odom finished, there was a moment of quiet. "Bennett," Emily said, "has he been notified?" Halstead called him at 6 this morning. His access to hospital systems was suspended at the same time. Another pause. "He's been told not to come to the building pending the outcome of the audit." "And the board?" "Emergency session tonight. Raymond Cho, the retired member, has been contacted by the auditor for a separate interview." Odom's voice shifted slightly. "Emily, this is going to be messy for a while. The audit, the legal questions, the staff will need to be—" "I know," Emily said. "That's how this goes." It was. She didn't have illusions about what came after the acute phase of an institutional reckoning, the long, complicated process of determining what the damage actually was, who bore it, how it got repaired. Institutions didn't transform. They adjusted, slowly, imperfectly, under pressure applied from the right direction for long enough. She got dressed and drove to the hospital. Ouch. Bennett arrived at the building at 9:15 despite having been told not to. She didn't know this when it happened. She was in surgical recovery, post-rounds, reviewing Caleb's post-op notes. He'd come through the second procedure cleanly, fever resolved, drain output normalizing. When the commotion reached her as sound rather than information, voices in the corridor with the particular quality of voices that are trying to stay controlled and not entirely managing it. She went to the door. Down the corridor near the elevator bank, Bennett was standing in his coat with a briefcase and the expression of a man who has decided that presence is its own argument. Halstead's assistant, a young man named Owen, who had the build of someone who rode in college and the disposition of someone who would very much prefer not to use it, was positioned between Bennett and the elevator. "Sir," Owen was saying, "I need to ask you to wait in the lobby while I contact Ms. Halstead. I have materials in my office that are my personal property, and I have the right to retrieve them," Bennett said. His voice was the voice from the cafeteria. Flat, authoritative, the voice of a man reminding the room who gives instructions. But it was running at a frequency that was slightly too high, slightly too fast, and anyone who knew how to listen could hear the machinery behind it working too hard. "Sir, this is my hospital." "Not today," said Halstead. She'd come from the stairwell. She was in her coat and her close-cut white hair, and she moved with the particular authority of someone who does not feel the need to move quickly because they've already won the ground. She stopped 6 feet from Bennett and looked at him. "Kyle," she said, "you were asked not to come in. I have property. Your personal effects will be boxed by HR and available for pickup. That is standard procedure for suspended personnel." She held his gaze. "I'm asking you to leave now. If you don't, I'll ask Owen to call security, and this will happen in a way that is significantly more uncomfortable for everyone." The corridor was not empty. Nurses, 2 attendings, an orderly with a cart, everyone finding reasons to be stationary. The particular quality of witnesses who are not officially witnessing but will remember everything. Bennett looked at Halstead. He looked down the corridor. He looked at Emily, standing in the doorway of the surgical recovery unit in her scrubs, with her hands at her sides, and no expression that he could use for anything. Something moved through his face. She watched it happen, the collapse, in sequence, of the calculations he'd been running, not graceful, not swift. The slow mechanical failure of a structure whose load-bearing elements had been removed one by one until the thing that had seemed permanent proved not to be. He turned and walked to the elevator. Owen pressed the button. The doors opened. Bennett got in. The doors closed. The corridor held its breath for about 4 seconds, and then the ordinary sounds of a hospital resumed. Cartwheels, an intercom page, someone's muffled conversation through a room door, and the building continued doing what it had been doing before he arrived. Halstead looked down the corridor at Emily for a moment. Emily nodded once. Halstead nodded back and went to the stairwell. Emily returned to Caleb's post-op notes and was 3 lines in when her phone buzzed with an email notification from the hospital's legal team. She opened it. It was a formal notification that the personnel action filed against her, the termination notice dated Friday, had been voided in full by the audit committee and would be expunged from her file. She read it once. She put the phone face down on the desk. She finished the notes. At 11:40, she received a second notification. This one was from Hess, the auditor, sent to a distribution list that included Halstead, the board, and apparently Emily's HR file address. It was brief. The preliminary audit findings were complete and being prepared for formal report. The findings supported, Hess's language was careful but not ambiguous, systematic misuse of administrative authority, falsification of personnel documentation, and coordinated witness tampering spanning a period of no less than 31 months. Emily read it in the break room with a cup of coffee that had gone cold. The findings were going to the state health department. That part Odom had told her the previous day. What Odom hadn't mentioned, or hadn't known, was the final line of Hess's notification, which read, "Based on preliminary findings, referral to the state licensing board for formal review of Director Bennett's professional certifications is recommended. Additionally, the matter has been flagged for review by the county district attorney's office regarding potential criminal liability related to document falsification." Emily sat with that for a moment. Criminal liability, licensing board, the machinery of institutional accountability moving at its own speed, in its own direction, no longer something Bennett could root around. She finished the cold coffee and went back to work. She was updating the afternoon board at 2 p.m. when Petra appeared at her shoulder again with the quiet efficiency that Emily had come to recognize as one of the more reliable things about this unit. "There's someone at the nursing station," Petra said. "Not a patient family. She asked for you specifically. Didn't give her name, but she has a visitor badge from the 5th floor. 5th floor, the senator's suite. "Thank you," Emily said. She walked to the station. The woman waiting there was in her early 40s, dressed with the careful neutrality of someone whose job required her to move through many different environments without signaling allegiance to any of them. She had a lanyard and a badge that identified her as senior staff to the senator's office. "Ms. Carter," she said, "Senator Aldrin would like to see you when you're available. This afternoon, if possible. He said to tell you." She paused, checking her phone for the exact phrasing. "He said to tell you that this time he'll make his own coffee." Emily looked at her for a moment. Something moved in her chest that was not quite a laugh, but was adjacent to one. "Tell him I'll be up after my 4 o'clock patient check," she said. The woman nodded and left. Emily turned back to her board. She had 3 patients to check, a chart to finalize, and a conversation on the 5th floor that she had not expected and did not know the full shape of yet. What she did know, what she had known since the elevator that morning, since the text message, since the governance meeting, since the cafeteria, since longer ago than any of that, was that she had been building toward this moment for years without calling it that. Not the vindication, not the acknowledgement. Those were outcomes, and outcomes were never the point. The point was the work. The point was staying. The point was knowing what you knew and doing what you could with it, and not leaving when leaving would have been easier. She picked up her pen and started on the 3 o'clock chart. And somewhere in the hospital above her, in a room she'd visited 2 days ago, a man who had almost died on a lobby floor was waiting to say something to the person who'd read him correctly in 40 seconds. And he was going to discover, as most people did eventually, that Emily Carter was harder to thank than she was to underestimate, which was saying something, because she had never been easy to underestimate at all. The chart was almost done when her pager went off. Not her phone. Her pager, the backup device that the hospital issued to all clinical staff and that almost nobody used anymore except in system failures and genuine mass casualty events. The code on the screen was one she recognized. She was already moving before she'd consciously decided to. The code on the screen was one she recognized. She was already moving before she'd consciously decided to. The pager code was a mass casualty alert. Not a drill designation, not a test prefix, just the raw code that meant the hospital was about to receive more than it currently had capacity for. She hadn't seen it used in a real event since a training exercise 18 months before she'd arrived at Riverside, but the number was the same across every facility she'd worked in, a standard she'd memorized the way you memorize things that keep people alive. She hit the stairwell at a jog. The 3rd-floor landing had 2 nurses already in it, moving fast, and she caught fragments from their radio. Highway incident, multiple vehicles, county EMS reporting 8 confirmed critical, more incoming. And then she was through the door and into the main corridor, where the emergency coordination was already assembling itself with the imperfect, urgent energy of a system that knew what it was supposed to do and was doing it while simultaneously discovering what it had forgotten to prepare for. Dr. Voss was in the corridor. He saw Emily and pointed. "Trauma bay. Now. We're activating the overflow protocol." She followed him. The next 4 hours were the kind that don't resolve into narrative while they're happening. They exist as sequence: patient, assessment, intervention, handoff, next patient. And the mind operating inside them doesn't reflect or narrate because there isn't space for that. There is only the information in front of you and the decision it requires. 8 critical patients arrived in 90 minutes. A highway pileup involving a commercial truck, 2 passenger vehicles, and a school transport van that had, by some combination of physics and driver response, avoided the worst of the impact, but not all of it. The critical cases were adults. The van passengers were treated separately, mostly for shock and minor lacerations, by a separate triage team working in a side corridor that had been cleared and repurposed in 12 minutes. Emily worked the trauma bay. She was not the senior clinician in the room, Voss was, and 2 attendings from surgical services had been pulled from their afternoon schedules. But she functioned in the space that trauma medicine requires from its best practitioners: the lateral awareness, the ability to track multiple presentations simultaneously, to flag the thing that isn't loudest but is most urgent. She called 2 things that the room hadn't caught yet. One was a tension pneumothorax developing in a man whose external injuries were misleadingly minor. The other was a spinal precaution that needed reassessment on a woman who'd been moved in a way that should have been flagged earlier and hadn't been. Neither call was dramatic. Both mattered. At 6:40 p.m., the last critical patient was stabilized and moved to ICU. Emily stood at the sink in the trauma bay and washed blood off her forearms. Her gloves had torn during the pneumothorax intervention, a small thing, the kind of small thing that happens, and looked at the drain running pink and then clear and thought nothing in particular. Her mind was in the phase that comes after, the flat, quiet expanse of having given everything and finding there was still something left. Voss came in behind her. He stood at the adjacent sink. 6 out of 8, he said. The other 2 are in surgery. Odds are good. She nodded. You caught the pneumothorax 8 minutes before I would have, he said. He said it plainly, not as praise exactly, more as a fact he was handing over. Maybe, she said. Not maybe. He dried his hands. He looked like he wanted to say something else and was deciding how to say it. Voss was not, she had concluded, a bad doctor. He was a doctor who had allowed institutional comfort to soften certain edges, who had spent enough years in a structure that rewarded his seniority that he'd stopped noticing the things his seniority made invisible to him. That was its own kind of damage. I didn't listen to you on Monday, he said. In the lobby. Long enough. You listened when it counted, she said. That's generous. It's accurate. She turned off the tap. You changed the treatment direction when the evidence was there. That's what matters. He accepted this without arguing, which was itself a kind of growth. He left. Emily dried her hands and went back to the unit. She remembered the 5th floor at 7:15. The senator's aide had said this afternoon, and it was now closer to evening, and under ordinary circumstances she might have sent a message and rescheduled for the following day. But the pager had not been ordinary circumstances, and she was still in the building, and she was, she realized, tired in a way that had nothing to do with the last 4 hours and everything to do with the last 7 months, and there was something she needed to do before she went home. She took the elevator to the 5th floor. The corridor was quieter than it had been that morning. Garrett was still there. She suspected he was one of those people who didn't go home until the principal was discharged. And he nodded at her without moving from his position, which was the equivalent, she'd come to understand, of a warm greeting. She knocked. A voice said, "Come in." Aldrin was sitting fully upright now, which was progress. He'd been moved from the bed to the chair by the window, which he'd clearly negotiated for at some point in the afternoon. He looked better and worse simultaneously. Better physically, worse in the way that people look when they've had time to think. "You're late," he said. "Mass casualty event," she said. "Highway incident." He absorbed this. "How many?" 8 critical in, 2 still in surgery, the rest stable. He was quiet for a moment. "Sit down." She sat. "I've been informed about what happened today," he said, "with the governance meeting, the audit." He paused. "Bennett." "Okay." "I want you to know that my office has been in contact with the state health department since yesterday afternoon. Not at your request and not as a favor. Because what I was told about the pattern of conduct at this institution is the kind of thing that requires a response at a level above the hospital's internal process." He held her gaze. "That's not me interfering. That's me doing the part of my job that applies here." "I understand. The licensing board referral will proceed through proper channels. My office won't influence the outcome, but I can make sure it isn't buried." He turned the water glass on his tray table a quarter turn, a gesture that felt habitual, something to do with his hands while he organized his thoughts. "What do you need from me? Directly, not through channels." Emily considered the question. It was asked without performance, which made it easier to answer honestly. "A written account," she said. "Your account of Monday. What you observed, what you were told, what the timeline was. Not for media. For the audit record. Witness accounts from people without institutional conflicts carry weight. You'll have it by tomorrow morning. That's all I need." He studied her for a moment. "That's not what I expected you to ask for." "What did you expect?" "Something larger, a position, a platform, a formal commendation." He said it without judgment. People who've been through what you've been through in the last week usually want the record corrected loudly. Emily looked at him. Outside the window, Harlow Falls was doing its evening thing. Streetlights coming on, traffic thinning, the particular grayish-gold quality of a Midwestern October dusk. The record being corrected accurately is enough, she said. Loudly is someone else's business. He smiled. It reached his eyes, which was not always the case with people who had practiced smiling for decades. The nurse who everyone dismissed, he said. That's one way to tell it. What's yours? She thought about it, not performing the thinking, actually running through the question, which deserved more than a reflexive answer. A person who stayed, she said finally. That's mostly what it is. I stayed when it would have been easier to go. I wrote things down when it would have been easier to forget them. I did the work when the work wasn't going to be credited. She paused. That's not heroism. That's just not quitting. He was quiet for a moment. I've been in public life for 26 years, he said. I've met a lot of people who are very good at explaining why what they do matters. You're the first person in recent memory who seems genuinely uninterested in the explanation. Explaining it doesn't change what it is, she said. No, he said. It doesn't. She stood. Get some rest. Chow wants your oxygen saturation stable before he talks discharge, and you've been in that chair long enough. He made a sound that was not quite protest and not quite agreement. You're going to be a very difficult person to have as a healthcare provider. I've been told, she said. She left him to the window and the evening and went home. Int. The formal audit report was released 3 weeks later. Emily read it on a Tuesday morning at her kitchen table with coffee that was still hot, which was unusual. The report ran to 61 pages, including appendices, and she read all of it, which took 2 hours. It was not pleasant reading. Documents written in the language of institutional accountability have a particular quality, precise and comprehensive and bloodless, as if the damage being described happened in a controlled environment rather than to people who went home every night and felt it. The findings confirmed everything and added detail she hadn't known. Kyle Bennett's systematic personnel actions had affected 23 staff members over 31 months. Of those, 14 had left the hospital. 6 had experienced documented impacts on their subsequent employment, references withheld, records notated in ways that followed them to other facilities. 2 had left healthcare entirely. One, a nurse named Sandra Osei, who had filed an internal complaint in her second year and been managed out within 60 days, had attempted to report the situation to the state health department and been discouraged from proceeding by a board process that the audit characterized in its careful language as lacking appropriate independence from administrative influence. Sandra Osei. Emily wrote the name in her notebook. The audit findings went to the state health department, the licensing board, and, per the auditor's recommendation, the county district attorney's office. The DA's office opened a formal inquiry within 10 days. The licensing board scheduled a formal hearing. These things move slowly. Emily knew how slowly. She had watched institutional processes move before and had learned to judge their direction rather than their speed. Bennett's professional certifications were suspended pending the hearing. His access to all Riverside systems had been permanently revoked. The employment separation was completed and documented, with a formal notation that rendered him ineligible for rehire at any institution in the hospital's network. Darren Wolf resigned. His resignation was accepted, and the circumstances of his departure, the voluntary statement, the cooperation, were factored into the DA's inquiry in ways that Odom said would probably result in a civil rather than criminal resolution. Odom said this neutrally, without opinion. Emily received it the same way. Wolf had been used, and he had also been willing to be used, and both of those things were true simultaneously, and the system would determine what that combination warranted. Raymond Cho, the retired board member, was referred to the state's nonprofit governance oversight body for a review of his conduct during his tenure. This was the quietest of the consequences, and possibly the most significant in terms of what it addressed, the way systems protect their internal failures by routing problems through people who have a stake in the problem staying internal. Greg Tullis was not disciplined. The audit concluded that his role in the personnel action against Emily had been the result of deception rather than participation. He came to Emily's unit on the Thursday after the report was released and stood near the nursing station with the expression of someone who has been carrying something heavy and is not sure whether to put it down or keep holding it as penance. I should have looked at what I was signing, he said. Yes, Emily said. He seemed surprised she didn't soften it. I'm sorry. I know you are. She looked at him. Now do the thing you should have done then, which is pay attention to everything, not just the things that are comfortable to see. He nodded slowly. He left. She thought he would actually do better. People who feel genuine guilt rather than managed guilt tend to correct in lasting ways. She'd seen it before. The hospital board convened a special session in the fourth week of November to address the audit findings publicly and outline corrective measures. The session was open to staff, unusual, and Halstead's decision, which told Emily something about the direction Halstead intended to move in. The boardroom held 40 people. The corridor outside held 30 more. Watching through the open door on a live stream, the communications team had set up in a decision that had surprised everyone, including the communications team. Emily went. She sat near the back. She didn't bring her notebook. Halstead spoke for 20 minutes. She did not use the word unfortunate. She did not use the phrase going forward as a way of redirecting away from what had happened. She said, people were harmed by a system that was supposed to protect them, and that failure was institutional, and the institution is responsible for it. She said it in the plain, declarative language of a person who has decided that a clean record is worth more than a managed one. There was no applause when she finished. The room was quiet in the way that rooms are quiet when people are absorbing something that changes what they thought they knew about where they were. Then Voss stood up. He didn't have prepared remarks. Emily could tell by the way he paused before starting. The pause of a person organizing thoughts rather than accessing them. I want to say something about Monday of last month, he said, because it's relevant to what we're talking about, which is what happens when people are not listened to. He looked around the room. I am a senior physician at this institution. I have been one for 12 years, and there was a morning when a staff nurse told me something critical about a patient, and I did not give it the weight it deserved immediately, because of where she was in the hierarchy, because I assumed the assessment would match my own. A pause. It didn't. And the patient is alive in part because she persisted and in part because I eventually listened. He sat down. That's what the hierarchy costs us. That's worth naming. The room absorbed this also. Emily looked at her hands in her lap. She thought about Sandra Osei, whose name was in the audit report and who was somewhere in the world right now, not knowing whether anything that had happened to her had mattered to anyone. She thought about the other names in those 61 pages. The people who had filed complaints and been managed out, who had left medicine, who had carried the cost of an institution's failure in their bodies, in their bank accounts, and their professional histories. She thought about the notebook she'd kept since her first week, the habit she'd never broken, the record that had mattered precisely because she had maintained it without knowing if it would ever be needed. The meeting ended. People filtered out in small groups, talking in the low, careful voices of people who are recalibrating something they thought they understood. Odom found her in the corridor. There's something the board approved this morning, Odom said, before the session. I wanted to tell you before you heard it through someone else. Emily waited. A new position, trauma protocol development and staff training, reporting directly to the clinical director, not through administrative operations. Odom paused. It's designed around the gap that Monday exposed, the gap between clinical assessment and hierarchical deference, how we train staff to speak and how we train leadership to listen. She looked at Emily directly. Halstead wants you in it, if you want it. Emily was quiet for a moment. It was not the position Jarvis had offered her, the stateside military training role, which was still open and which Jarvis had mentioned twice more without pressing. It was not the return to deployment that some part of her had been half expecting to feel called back to. It was something she hadn't anticipated, which made it, in some ways, the most honest answer to a question she'd been carrying for 7 months. What are you doing here? Tell Halstead I'll think about it, Emily said. Odom nodded. She said you'd say that. She said to tell you the offer is open until you're ready. She called Jarvis that evening from the parking structure. The same parking structure where Wolf had stood with his phone 40 seconds from running, the same structure where the ordinary-looking machinery of consequence had quietly activated around him. She sat in her car with the engine running and the heater doing its slow work against the November cold. "There's a position here," she said when Jarvis picked up. "Odom told me." A pause. "She called me this afternoon." "Of course she did." "It's a good position, Emily." "It's a very different position than the one you're offering." "Yes." "Your offer. The training development role. The timeline. Flexible, I told you that." "I know." Emily looked out the windshield at the concrete columns of the parking structure, the fluorescent lights, the ordinary geography of a place where something small and important had happened. "I'm not saying no to yours. I'm saying I need to do something here first." Jarvis was quiet for a moment. "There are names in the audit report," Emily said. "People who reported and weren't heard. I want to make sure what happened here, the mechanism that allowed it, the specific failure points, gets built into training material that other institutions can use. Not just this hospital, widely." She paused. "That takes time." "How much time?" "I don't know yet." "Emily," Jarvis's voice had the texture of someone saying something they've decided to say and have been deciding for a while. "You have been carrying the weight of institutions for your entire career. Military, civilian, it doesn't matter. You show up, you do the work, you absorb the cost when the system fails, and you don't leave. I'm asking you to consider at some point, not now, not as an ultimatum, what it would look like to do work that also takes care of you." Emily sat with that. "This would take care of me," she said finally. "This kind of work." "I know," Jarvis said. "I know it would." A pause. "Call me when you're ready." "I will." She drove home through the Harlow Falls night, the mid-sized city that had rebuilt itself twice, that had a river running through its east side and a medical center that had just been forced to look at itself honestly. That was, like every city and every institution and every person, imperfect and ongoing and capable of change when the pressure came from the right direction. She ate dinner standing at the counter, which was a habit she was aware of and had never bothered to break. She sat with the audit report for another 20 minutes, not reading, she'd read it, but thinking about the sections that dealt with training and reporting structures, the places where the recommendations were technically correct and practically insufficient, the gaps that someone with her specific combination of experience could see clearly because she had lived inside every version of those gaps. She thought about Sandra Osei. In the morning, she was going to ask the hospital's legal team whether the audit's findings created grounds for the institution to reach out to former staff affected by Bennett's conduct, not as liability management, but as acknowledgement. She didn't know if the answer would be yes. She knew it was the right question. She went to bed. She slept, which was something she had not done reliably in 7 months. The formal acknowledgement ceremony, Halstead called it a recognition event, which was deliberately understated and therefore more accurate, was held on the first Friday of December in the hospital's main conference room, with staff invited and the senator's office represented by a written statement that was read aloud by his chief of staff. Emily stood at the front of the room in her regular scrubs because she'd been on shift until 30 minutes before and hadn't changed, which was not planned but felt, in retrospect, exactly right. The chief of staff read the senator's statement. It was well written. Someone on his staff was good at this. And it named what Emily had done in specific factual terms without inflating it into something cinematic. She appreciated that. The inflated version would have been easier to dismiss. Then Halstead spoke. Short, precise. No adjectives that weren't earned. Then Voss, again without prepared remarks, which was becoming a pattern that suggested he was doing something useful with his discomfort, turning it into honesty, which was the most functional thing discomfort can become. Then the room applauded. Emily stood in it and let it happen. She didn't deflect. She didn't minimize. She had learned finally that receiving acknowledgement without collapsing or performing was its own kind of discipline, and that people who had earned it owed it to themselves to stand still and let it land. She thought about the cafeteria, the tray on the floor, the 60 people who had found their shoes interesting, the voice that had told her she didn't belong. She thought about the FOB in Kandahar where a medic had stitched his own arm in the dark. She thought about Fallbrook, not the full weight of it, just the edge of it, the thing she was still working through in increments, the wound that had brought her here in the first place, and that was, she understood now, not separate from this moment, but part of the same long process of deciding what to do with what you'd survived. She thought about the notebooks, all those pages of small observations written in compressed shorthand, not for an audience, not for a case, just because stopping felt like losing something she needed to keep. The applause ended. She said thank you. She said it once, clearly, without attaching anything to it. Then she said, "There are names in the audit report I want to acknowledge. People who reported what was happening here before I arrived and were not protected. Sandra Osei, Rana Park, Thomas Beaumont, Marcus Webb." She said each name once. What happened to them matters as much as what happened to me. What changes here should be built to protect people like them, not people like me. People who report early without the leverage that circumstance happened to give me. She paused. Institutions protect what they measure. Start measuring the things that are currently invisible, and the protection follows. The room was quiet. She stepped back from the front of the room. Petra, from her position near the door, did the small, precise nod again. Emily received it the same way, as what it was, which was enough. 2 months later, the first draft of the new trauma assessment and hierarchical deference protocol, 42 pages, developed by Emily in collaboration with Voss, 2 external clinical consultants, and a training specialist Halstead had brought in from a research hospital in another state, went to the clinical director for review. The document opened with a principle rather than a procedure. Clinical assessment is not a function of institutional rank. The most accurate information in a room belongs to whoever has it, regardless of where they appear on an org chart. Structures that cannot receive that information will fail the patients depending on them. It was not a new idea. It was an old idea that institutions had to be forced to implement repeatedly by the accumulated cost of ignoring it. Emily had been one of those costs. She was done being that. She was now, instead, the person writing it down so that others didn't have to pay what she had paid to make the same point. The state licensing board hearing for Kyle Bennett was scheduled for the following spring. The DA's inquiry was ongoing. These things would take as long as they took, and the outcomes would be what they were. Emily followed them with the specific, undramatic attention she brought to everything. Not detachment, not obsession, just the clear-eyed awareness of a person who has learned to track important things without letting them track her. On a Tuesday morning in February, she received a letter at the hospital's address. The return address was a zip code she didn't recognize. The handwriting was careful, slightly formal, the writing of someone who had written this more than once before sending the version they sent. "Ms. Carter, I heard about what happened at Riverside through a friend who still works there. I was a nurse at that hospital for 3 years before I left. My name is Sandra Osei. I don't know if you know who I am, but from what I've been told, you made sure others did. I wanted to say that the fact that someone finally looked at those records and said those names out loud, it matters. More than I can explain in a letter. I left nursing. I've been doing other work. I don't know if I'll go back, but I wanted you to know that the documenting you did, the staying when it would have been easier to go, it reached further than you were probably standing when you did it. Thank you." Emily read the letter at the nursing station before her shift started. She read it twice. She put it in the pocket of her scrubs and kept it there all day. She didn't have a response ready, and she didn't try to construct one. Some things require time. She would write back. She would write back carefully, in her own words, without performing gratitude or resolution she hadn't arrived at yet. Because that was the truth of it. Not the ceremony, not the audit, not the policy document, not the acknowledgement in the conference room. The truth of it was a letter from a woman she'd never met, who had carried something alone for years, and had just found out she hadn't been entirely alone after all. That was what the work was for. Not the vindication, not the recognition, not the moment when the people who dismissed you are forced to revise their assessment. The work was for the person at the end of the chain who needed to know that someone had looked, had written it down, had stayed. Emily put her bag in her locker and pulled on her gloves and went to do her rounds. She was not a legend. She was not a hero. She was a person with specific skills and a habit of documentation and a deep, unglamorous commitment to staying in the room when leaving was available. She'd been dismissed by people who looked at her and saw the surface, the blue scrubs, the overnight rotation, The staff nurse who sat at the wrong table. They saw the thing they expected and stopped looking. That was always the mistake. Not theirs specifically. Everyone's. The universal human habit of mistaking the visible for the whole, the title for the competence, the quiet for the absence of something worth hearing. The doors to the surgical recovery unit swung open. She walked in. The unit was doing what it always did. Monitors, movement, the low, urgent hum of a place where people were getting better. Slowly, imperfectly, because someone was paying attention. Emily Carter was paying attention. She had always been paying attention. And now, finally, everyone knew it.